Good morning, everybody. I'm Will from BMI Imaging. Thank you for joining the webinar, and it is Know Your Aperture Cards, the ins and outs of the mysterious Aperture card. So today we're going to be talking about Aperture cards, and if you're on this webinar, I'm guessing you have some and are interested in learning more. And what I'm going to do here, I need to hide a few things on my screen that you're not able to see, just so I can see my screen better. Okay, let's get started. So before we actually dive into the topic of Aperture cards themselves, what I wanted to go over a few nuts and bolts items regarding how you're going to watch this webinar and things you can do from your side. So on your screen, you should have something at the top like this that will let you move the what you're seeing, the picture of me, wherever you want on the screen, top, left, bottom, right, or you can just hide it. If you don't want to watch me, you just want to watch the screen, you can absolutely hide that. I will not be offended. And next, here is the panel on the right that's going to allow you to interact. You are muted, so you're not able to speak while I'm doing the presentation, or actually through the whole thing. But what you can do is actually click that little caret for the question bar. And if you have a question during the webinar, please type your question. If I see it, I'll answer it as I go along, but I will have time at the end to answer any questions. But at this moment, could you click this little hand here so I can so you can raise your hand so I know that you can see my screen and you can hear me. Let's see. All right. Looks like that's working. Perfect. So now we will dive into the actual topic. And so the purpose of the webinar today, I have a couple points here. One is to help you understand your Aperture cards. These are not normal type of record. They're kind of legacy records that they're still around a lot, but they're kind of hidden. Only certain people really know about them. So knowing a bit about these Aperture cards and what you can do with them will be important if you decide to digitize. And then also provide you solutions if and when you do decide to scan your records into an electronic format. The plan for today, one, I'll define Aperture cards, what they are. We'll go over a couple different formats, indexing, how to estimate how many you have, and then some scanning costs. And then lastly, answer any questions that you may have about Aperture cards. And by the end of this webinar, what I'm hoping is that you will have a better understanding of how your Aperture cards can be digitized so you can move from analog to digital. And also, you feel comfortable about your choice when you do decide to digitize. For a lot of people, going from what they know, how their records are and exist currently, moving into a different format can be a bit troubling. So this should hopefully make you feel more comfortable about making that move. All right, so what are Aperture cards? Here's a picture on screen. And an Aperture card is basically a card. It's about 3.5 inches tall by 7.5 inches wide. And what it has in it on the right side when you're looking at it is a hole or an aperture. So it's an aperture within a card. It's an Aperture card. And what you're looking at here is a specific type of card that we'll go into in a little bit of detail. But I also have a couple examples physically here that you can see. Here's an example of a card. You can see it's a little bit different from what's on screen. And there's nothing on it, just the image, and that's it. This card here, you can see that there's a title block on top, and that's it. Here's an example of no image, it's just blank, but there's a sticky note attached. Here's another type, and another. So you can see that although they are all Aperture cards, there are multiple different types that can affect how you scan, what you want to do with them, how you get them to a digital system, and then maybe some costs. We'll get into that next. So the various types of Aperture cards, we'll start with this one. This is what we call a standard Aperture card. And the reason we call it a standard Aperture card is because it's a 35mm frame and it's just a plain card. What that means is you just have one frame, one Aperture with the image inside of it, and there's nothing else on the card besides maybe the title block, maybe some writing, maybe nothing at all, but it's a standard card. The next type The difference is this is a Hollerith Aperture card. It's also 35 millimeter, which is the size of that frame there, the size of the film that can fit in that aperture. But you can see these punch holes here. Those are called Hollerith, and it ties into indexing the records, which we'll touch on later. But you can see there's a big difference between this card, the standard card, and then the Hollerith card. And lastly, there's another type that is the 16 millimeter Aperture card. And in this case, it's actually a 2-channel, so there are 2 little jackets there, 2 rows with 16 millimeter images, and those are different from 35 millimeter images, which are like engineering drawings, newspapers, things like that, and then 16 millimeter drawings, which are usually like office-sized documents if they were in their original paper format. So you can see that a standard 35 millimeter card with 16 millimeter images in it, a Hollerith 35 millimeter card, and then a 16 millimeter Aperture card. So those are the general main types you have that you might see in your collection. Now, how many Aperture cards do I have? That is a question we get a lot from folks, because if we get someone contacting us, emailing about, hey, what does it cost to do this project, or giving us a call, I want to scan my Aperture cards, how much is it going to cost per card for the project? One of the most important questions we ask those people is, well, how many do you have? And you can see if I have a little stack like this, like I showed you earlier, I can just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 Aperture cards. But if you have a stack like this, or maybe you have cabinets full of this type of material, you may not want to count individual cards. That would be quite the task. So what you can do to get a good ballpark estimate is just what you see in this picture here. You take a ruler, I actually have the same ruler right here, and you just measure out, if they're stacked up next to each other, you just measure out about 1 inch. You can do ½ an inch, whatever works for you, but we usually just say inch, so pinch 1 inch. You grab a stack and then count those individual cards. So if you took 1 inch of cards from, let's say, a drawer, and you counted those out, and you had, let's say, 90. Well, then you just take your ruler and measure the rest of your collection. Maybe it's a couple drawers worth, or you have 100 inches of cards, and then you just extrapolate that. So if you have 90 cards in 1 inch, times 100 inches would be about 9,000 or so cards. It's not going to be exact. It's a good ballpark, though, so that we know what we're working with and you have an idea of the scope of your project. Again, it's a quick method. You probably don't want to, even if you just have a couple hundred, you don't want to count cards. Just try to get a good idea of how much is in a certain length, and then just extrapolate there, 90 times 100, whatever it is, and you can get a ballpark. Usually, you're going to have about 100 cards per inch. So if you don't even want to count your inch, figure there's about 100. That's a good place to start. Okay, indexing. So going back to the different types of cards and how you can index, it'll depend on what type of card you have. And indexing basically means once we scan and digitize your records and you have a virtual file, how you're going to name them once they're in electronic format. So we'll start with the Hollerith card. You can see here you have your 35 millimeter image. You do have information on the title block, and then you have your Hollerith punch holes. And what these punch holes should correlate to is this information on the top. Sometimes you don't have the title information, you just have the Hollerith, I think. Let me check that. I thought I might have an example of that, but no, it also has the title information. So occasionally you will see cards that only have the Hollerith and no title information. So the Hollerith may be the only way you're going to capture that indexing data. But if you do see information on top, usually these holes actually mean something depending on their locations, how many holes are punched in each row and column. So that should correlate to this information right here. So if we were indexing via the Hollerith method, we could scan on a certain scanner that would actually read these punch holes and should kind of pump out that data that correlates to that title or whatever is captured in that Hollerith data. So that's one way you can index, is just you say, I want whatever's on the Hollerith, just give me that. There's a reason someone punched those in, that it was created that way. There's some type of data that could be useful or probably will be useful when you get the digital image. Then we just tie the digital image to the Hollerith data and you have a file name. Next is the title block method, which in cases where you don't have Hollerith, that's one of 2 ways you will have to index the files. So in this case, the title block is right up here. And in this example, We scan the Aperture card. Let's say we make a multi-page file of these images. That title block information will be used to create the digital file. In this case, it would be an application number and a roll number. So you might get something like 8511138_502.pdf. And then you'll have however many cards you have, maybe a couple thousand, tens of thousands. They'll be named by this information. Now with the title block, unlike the Hollerith where you just run it through, it reads it and pumps out whatever it reads, you may have more information than just these two fields here. Each card may have different information. Maybe the house number is labeled on one, but not on this one. Or on another card, there's a roll number, or there isn't a roll number like there's on this. So it can get a little tricky based on what fields you want to capture or how much information is on there. Sometimes there can be information overload. There's just too much. You don't need it all. So you do have to do a little work with your scanning partner of what exactly you want captured from that title block. And lastly, we have image level indexing. So let's say you were doing a project and you have 100,000 Aperture cards and they have Hollerith. Well, sometimes the Hollerith doesn't read because it just, maybe it's an old card, it's just not working well, and you still want some index information. We can actually go to the image itself. So we scan the card, we capture that image, and then we actually just look at that image and find some information on there to call your digital file by something. Now, the example here, I put question marks because that's the most variable method of indexing, because on this image, we'll have to specify, or you'll have to specify which information you want. If it's an engineering drawing, there may be a title block somewhere. Usually it's on the bottom right. Occasionally it moves around. There may be information somewhere else on that image that you want captured. So that'll have to be specified. How many formats are there? What information do you need? But it does require someone to look at that actual image once it's scanned in a full view to find that indexing data, which can be a little more expensive because it's just more manual labor in finding that information. So those are the three main methods of indexing Aperture cards. Moving on to the next topic is framing. So framing, give me a second here, let me click something out. Okay, so framing is, there's scanning and then there's post-processing. Framing is part of the post-processing of an Aperture card scanning project. What that means is if I have this card, I scan the card, I scan the image, and then what do I do with that image? There are a couple of ways that you can get your digital file back, but framing is basically taking that image and creating, when, let's say you open a PDF, you see page 1 and there's a nice clean image. That's pretty much what framing means. You're cropping this out and presenting that as its own image instead of maybe this entire card. So let's do a few examples here. Okay. So we have that same 35mm Hollerith Aperture card. And in this instance, it's a 35mm card. So you have a 35mm Aperture, and it's a 35mm image as well. So there's an engineering drawing. And framing would be that particular spot, and then creating a digital file that if you open up a PDF, it'll look like what you have on screen there. Pretty straightforward. You have one image and then one file image. So it's a nice match. That's the most straightforward way to frame Aperture cards. Next, we have our 16mm Aperture card, and I'll show you two examples of how you can frame this. So you'll notice here that this is 16mm, 2 channels, and one channel is actually empty. But then the other channel, you have multiple 16mm images. So one way to frame this is still just framing the entire Aperture area. Now, if you have a PDF file, let's say we're making one PDF per Aperture card, that's what you'd see. Now, you may think, why would I ever do this? This is just an extreme example where these are really small images, but I like this Aperture card. If you remember back on the, actually, I'll go back to it. If you remember the other Aperture card that had 16mm images, like this, it may not be a big deal if you just get that one frame and have those two smaller images you can zoom in on and look around, print it out, whatever you want to do. It may not be a big deal if you just capture that one frame. But in this case, with the 8 images per card, you may not want that. So what you can do instead is actually frame each individual image. Now, the benefit is you get each image as a full-size electronic file The downside is it is more expensive to do that. You can imagine why. I'm not just saying, okay, give me the whole frame. Now I have to go and individually frame and crop each image, which this is pretty clean. They're not always this nice. Sometimes you have kind of de-skewed, they're kind of randomly assorted. It really depends on your particular material, but this would come out like this if you decide to individually crop each image. So if we were giving you a PDF file per card, we'd scan all this, crop the images, and you'd have a 2, 4, 6, 8, an 8-page PDF file where each page on the PDF is a full-size image like that. Probably what you'd want to do, but there are many variations of how you could do types of cards that we receive in multiple images. You may or may not want to frame them, but in this case, it does make the most sense because it's probably just too small as one frame. Scanning costs, always a fun topic. Very generally, you're looking at about 25 cents to 75 cents a card. And I say very generally because we're not trying to trick you or anything or hide information from you. That is a good range of where you're looking depending on numerous factors. So if you have a stack of cards, if you have 100,000 cards, 50,000, 20, whatever it is, that's a range that you can at least have an idea of what it may cost, but there are other factors that come into play, which I'll show you right here in this infographic. So this is from our blog article called How Much Does Aperture Card Scanning Cost? You can find that on our website. And these are the 9 main factors that generally play into your scanning price if you work with us. The 2 most important are the number of cards and then indexing. So if you came to me, you said, let's say I contacted BMI and I didn't work here. I said, okay, I have 5 Aperture cards. How much does it cost? Hey, on your website, you said it's 25 cents a card. I would, whoever picked up would say, well, that's not really the case with 5 Aperture cards. This price is usually based around larger projects of a couple thousand to tens to hundreds of thousands of cards, and then the method in which we scan and index. So if you just have a handful of cards, that's not your price. If you have a couple thousand, tens of thousands, something like that, you are starting to look in that area. But the number of cards is critical because volume does affect your price. And then indexing, as we went into before, that can have a big impact on how we scan your cards and then what we have to do to index them. If it's just title block indexing, usually pretty straightforward. If it's Hall Earth indexing, you're on the lower end of the overall price because you can run it through certain scanners that capture that. If you're going to image level indexing or cropping out multiple images and then indexing each one of those, you're starting to push up the price. It could surpass this, but it's a good place to start if you have a pretty large collection. And then you have a couple other factors that are important, but the 2 most important for scanning and the cost are the number of cards and indexing. All right, delivery and output. What that means is we scan your cards, we process them, we index them, and then how do we get them to you? From our perspective, there are really 2 main methods. One of which we call the traditional output method. And we call it that because if we were talking, you said, yeah, I want to scan my Aperture cards, most of the time our clients are thinking scanning, digital, PDFs. They think of PDFs, TIFFs, JPEGs, what you probably use on a daily basis at your work. You're popping up a digital file, it's a PDF or something of that sort. So that's why we call it traditional. And when you get that, let's say you have a 16mm Aperture card, we deliver as a PDF file, name it whatever it's going to be named based on the indexing, and then you have your file, and it's going to look like that. That's the traditional method. You could get black and white or grayscale images. Black and white basically means it's going to be black and white. There's no tonality, there's no kind of gradation. Grayscale gives you a little more realism, I guess, to the original document, depending on the quality of your material. If the original images are kind of, let's say they're old records or they're just kind of shabby, you may want grayscale because it'll bring out a little more nuance, but black and white could work. But either way, traditional gives you one or the other, or both actually. Now, the other method compared to traditional is our digital reel application, which it is something we created for microfilm back in the day, but we apply it to a lot of projects these days. And what you get with that is this is an actual picture clipping from digital reel. So what we do is we scan your Aperture card and we present it as the original file. So what you're seeing is actually what you'd be looking at within your application. This particular customer we scanned about 1 million Aperture cards, and every single one of them is in digital reel, and they can see this image and then actually click on the individual images, the frames, to look at the file itself. And then from there, you can export PDFs, you can do text searching, you can share it, send a link to someone, but it allows you to have that original context, which you don't get with the traditional method. So why is that important? Because if you scan your cards and you get traditional method, you get your image, you have it indexed, whatever way you want indexed, and then these go into storage, or maybe you shred them, destroy them because you think you don't need them anymore. If you wanted to see that original document, if it's in storage, you'd have to go get it, which is kind of a pain. You'd have to keep these, first of all. And then also, if you got rid of them, you're stuck. You don't know what the original context of that card is. With this method, you are able to see the original document, which is maybe has some information that you need that is not on these images. So let's say you had this card and you want to name the files by the application number. If you did the traditional method, you have an 8-page PDF named by 851138.pdf, and that's it. If you didn't have the card, you would never know that, well, why did it come from roll 502, or why is that important? Or maybe there was a street name, an address, house number, whatever it is. You wouldn't have that. Something else, here's just an interesting example. This is the one that has no microfilm image, but there's a sticky on it. If you're doing the traditional method, this is what you get. That's it. But you wouldn't have this sticky note. If you had it in digital reel, we'd actually include that sticky note right there. You'd see, oh, there's a reason that's there. So you can get either. They both work. It really depends on your circumstance, what's best for you. But there are multiple ways to scan your cards, so you shouldn't be kind of pigeonholed into you must do it one way or the other. Explore your options, see what works for you. All right, now it's a pretty short webinar. Aperture cards are unique, but there's not a lot to them. It really comes down to your particular project and what you need. So I'll jump into the questions section, see if there are any questions from you folks out there. Let me pop that up. Okay, first one. Do you scan microfiche? Yes, we scan microfiche, very similar to Aperture cards. You may have 35 millimeter microfiche that kind of look like, they have a bunch of these images on it. It's just a kind of a different layout. We do scan microfiche and microfilm as well, so yes. And then there's one more. Are you able to pick up my cards? I think that relates to if we were working together on a project, can we pick up your records? The answer is yes, with some qualifications around that. Transportation does depend on a lot of things like the size of the project, where you're located, a couple other things, but those are the primary two. So our scanning facility, we have two facilities. They're both in California. One's in Sacramento, and I'm at our Sunnyvale office, which is near San Jose, California. And all film scanning, Aperture cards, microfiche, microfilm, are done at the office I'm in Sunnyvale. So if we were working together, the cards would have to come to this location. How we get them here, most customers ship them. I just received a project this week where the person boxed it up in just a USPS package and got it sent. You can use FedEx, UPS, whatever method suits you best. Send it to us and we scan your cards and get them back to you. Other projects we can pick up, usually for really large projects. Couple examples, we were in Texas recently, New Mexico, Oregon, and we were picking up projects, but these are like a couple 100,000 Aperture cards, lots of material, and they're sizable enough where it makes sense for us to go do that work. So we can pick them up. It really depends on your project, how we do that whole transportation. See if there's anything else. I do not see anything, so I'll move to the next slide here. So if you do have questions or you just want to chat about Aperture cards, I'm happy to do that. My contact info, direct info, there's my email. It's the easy version, will@bmiimaging.com. You can call me directly. This is our 800 number that's all over the website. And then my extension is 217. Feel free to give me a call. And you can also chat with me, actually, if you go into our, actually two ways. If you go into our website, you see the chat bot. If you click around in there, there are two people that are on the chat, myself and my marketing colleague. So you'll be able to chat with me that way, or you can actually just type that URL into the search bar, click it, and it'll pop up a little window saying, hey, Will's available, start chatting. And it'll just give me a direct message. We can start chatting, which is quicker than email. Maybe you just don't want to be on the phone. That works too. So a couple different methods. And then here's some information just about the company. There's our website, bmiimaging.com. A lot of great info there. There's a blog on there that has a ton of information about Aperture cards, the process we use, the costs, just random questions about them, as well as microfilm, microfiche, paper scanning, general scanning, and document management. A lot of great information there. Our LinkedIn page, if you search for BMI Imaging, you can find it, or type that in the URL. And then we do have a YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and search for the Digital Imaging channel, will pop up. You'll see a big BMI logo. That's the channel logo. And we have about 18 or so videos on there now that cover a gamut of topics, some of which are for Aperture cards. So check that out. There's a lot of useful information there. But of course, if you have any specific questions or you want to talk about a project that you're working on, feel free to contact me. You may work with me or one of my colleagues, but would be happy to talk with you and see if we can work together. So hope you enjoyed the webinar. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, or if you're on our website and the blog, subscribe to our newsletter. You get an email every 2 weeks that gives you all new content. But that's all I have today. Let me just do one more check for questions. I don't see any, so appreciate you watching. I hope you join us next time, and have a nice rest of your day.